Welcome everyone to Welcoming the Stranger, the racial impact of U.S. immigration policy and the call of the church. This is being presented by Sojourners, which is part of the Commission on Mission and Social Justice run by Reverend Van Hook in the Riverside Church, and also a new group that's formed and very relevant to this time, the Taskforce on Antiracism, also at the Riverside Church. We had a program last week, as you all know, this week, and then we'll have our final class next week. First thing I'd like to do is acknowledge that as I sit here in my apartment in Inwood, I'm about 3 blocks from a bronze plaque that claims to be the place where the Lenape Indians sold Manhattan to Dutch settlers. And that's one of the things, when you're the victor, you get to write the history. And if you would ask the Lenape, I'm sure that they didn't think that's what happened during that occurrence. But sometimes might wins over right, and things have changed in this country from all of that. But I think we need to recognize they were here first, and we owe a debt of gratitude to them for managing the land for centuries before we got here. When you joined the class, we sent out a class information sheet that listed class covenant. Couple of things I want to mention related to that is make sure we all allow space for other people to talk. When you go into your breakout group, there'll be about 35 minutes, and depending on the number of people that wind up being in participants at that time, we'll determine, we'll have 4 or 5 people per group. And 2 things, again, make sure you allow everyone else the opportunity to talk. And if someone wants to take notes or send us information or give us feedback, there'll be instructions just to send it to me on my email, after the session. Again, that's totally voluntary, so feel free to do what you want. Another thing, which I sometimes am guilty, we sometimes have to pause for someone to finish speaking before jumping in to talk. So, because if 2 people are talking in the same group at the same time, it can be very, very confusing for people. So just ask that you respect those courtesies for your co-participants in this. So 2 people presenting today, Sumati Devatu and Linda Fetterman. Linda, I will turn it over to you because I think this slide is yours.
All right, thank you. So I'm Linda Fetterman. To frame our discussion, we are sharing a scripture passage which we hope will inspire our learning and understanding today. It is from the book of Ezekiel, chapter 47, verse 22. You shall allot it as an inheritance for yourselves and for the aliens who reside among you and have begotten children among you. They shall be to you as citizens of Israel. With you they shall be allotted an inheritance among the tribes of Israel. And now I'd like to turn over the beginning of our class to my fellow Riversider, Sumati Devadat. Next slide, please.
Thank you. I'm just trying to minimize here. There we go. I want to start with talking about where we were last week and where we're going today and where we'll be going essentially next week. Last week, we discussed the current situation of immigrants, the undocumented, those already here legally, those who are caught up in the fervent pursuit of the undocumented, that is the legal residents, and those who are attempting to enter the country now. We discussed the inhuman and illegal treatments that they are subjected to. This week and next, we discussed how we got to the present. In this session, we focus on developments between 1882, relatively late in America's history, when the first immigration law was enacted, to developments through the 1990s. And we have started, if you're hearing a lot of noise, it's a bunch of little kids outside, but they'll be gone pretty soon. Not immigrants, I'm sure. To help us get a understanding of this period, Linda and I have identified these factors that account for much that is happening. I'm going to assume that most of you understand what we mean by racism. I'd like to define the other terms. Nativism is the belief that America should be restricted to the descendants of the country's original settlers. That is the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants of England and some Northern Europeans. This originally excluded the Irish, Eastern and Southern Europeans, Italians, for example, Polish people and Jews, and all others. As we will see, the definition of white is limited in 1882. However, by the 1990s, other whites are co-opted into the white category, and that definition of white expands to include them, other ethnic groups. But it certainly does not include Blacks and people of color. White nationalism is more of a political concept. It holds that America should be politically controlled by whites. This was what was on display in the insurrection and attempted coup at the Capitol on January 6th. Racism, nativism, and white nationalism clash with another necessity in American history, that is the need for labor. That need fluctuates with cycles of growth and decline in the national economy. In down periods, job competition increases, popular anxiety, economic anxiety follows, and we will see that elites, whom we should have put on this list, capitalize on these popular anxieties for their own purposes. This role of the elites is consistent throughout American history. You can even see it today, and includes the present moment. Elites consistently exercise a powerful role in ginning up and organizing popular anxiety to impact legislation. Between 1882 and the 1990, we see America's doors opening and closing, and today it is definitely rapidly closing. Next slide, please. Next slide. Good, thank you. The Illegal Immigrant, that is the title of Cohen's first chapter, is, she emphasizes, because illegal immigrant, which is so dominant in the popular imagination, is not inevitable. The status can expand or contract because illegal is created by laws. It is a choice we make. And as we saw, it is supported by an infrastructure of agencies and funding to implement the laws. Next slide, please. The first laws to restrict immigration and define illegal were enacted relatively late in US history in 1882 and 1924. Until then, immigrants were encouraged to populate America, to work on farms and in industries during the period of rapid industrialization in the late 19th century. By the early 1900s, America had people from all over the world. A downturn, however, in the economy at the turn of the century and competition for jobs led to anti-immigration sentiments. Next slide, please. Elites organized to capitalize on popular anxiety about immigrants taking jobs. A word of explanation about elites. Who constitutes the elites changes over time, as we will see. In the early 20th century, it was the blue bloods of society, the Ivy Leaguers, people like Woodrow Wilson, who worried about the ability of non-English and non-Northern European immigrants to fully integrate into society. Wilson was concerned about the dilution of America's social and political white Anglo-Saxon Protestant heritage. According to Cohen, he was the first to use the phrase "America first," which was adopted quickly by the KKK and is very much current today. The elites of the early 20th century were concerned with racial purity, keeping America Anglo-Saxon and Northern European. As a result, Nativism and white nationalism emerge. The elites used junk science to justify racial superiority, racial hierarchy, and white nationalism. Next slide, please. The result of the elite organizing was the enactment of two laws. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act, prohibiting immigration of Chinese, and in 1924, the National Origins Act that placed quotas on Southern and Eastern Europeans who are not seen as whites. This is so hard to believe, but it's true, and whites did not include those groups of people. It also imposed prohibition on immigration of Asians and others. But the act did not apply to the US southern border, so Mexicans still come in. There were also no clear penalties, and the act was very poorly administered, so people came in without proper documentation. Next slide, please. As you notice, I go back and forth between present tense and past tense because when we did these slides, we had a different sense of how we should present it, but as I started to elaborate on them, I found that using the past was easier on occasion, so please bear with me. What were the consequences of the 1924 Immigration Origins Act? Because of the problems of lacking penalties and the lack of a strict kind of implementation of the law, checking people's credentials, registering them, and so on, there is now created in America the undocumented category of immigrants. These are people without documentation, and they will be a persistent presence in our national life. And this is because Mexicans continue to come. There was no control on the northern border, so actually Southern and Eastern Europeans entered that way. The controls were just on the East Coast. And so one very pronounced reality is that even though the desire is there to keep America white, America could not be kept white, Anglo-Saxon, and Northern European. And the Registry Act is established to regularize people so that they can become illegal. The term is regularized. The act is not renewed or is renewed periodically, but it was last renewed in 1972. The reason for creating the Registry Act was that by now the presence of undocumented immigrants is recognized as a problem because many of them were establishing lives in this country. They married Native Americans, that is people who'd already been here, and they integrated. Many were law-abiding, good people, but did not have papers. So the act was an attempt to provide them an avenue to legalization. And the failure to renew the act after 1972 has been a very serious problem, as we will see. Linda, it's you.
Thank you, Sumati. As Sumati has pointed out, the open southern border was the result of the National Origins Act, officially known as the Immigration Act of 1924, which closed entry to the U.S. through ports on the east and west coasts while leaving the northern and southern borders open. Since the U.S. still needed cheap labor, but had closed immigration from Europe and Asia, the southern border became the main route of entry for many immigrants. These not only included people from Mexico, Central America, and South America, but also many immigrants from Europe and Asia who could not enter the U.S. legally. The National Origins Act effectively created myths about the border, myths which continue to be propagated today. The border was viewed as a line to be defended, and the U.S. was seen as being under siege, likely to be invaded by undesirable people. This view ignored social, economic, and geographic reality. The southern border, a line drawn on a map, was a political designation that did not reflect the real lives of the people who lived there, whose ancestors had occupied the land for centuries, long before Texas, California, Arizona, and New Mexico became U.S. territory in the mid-19th century, and the U.S.-Mexico border was officially created. For many people who lived both north and south of the border did not exist in practice, since people depended on cross-border travel, trade, and labor to sustain their family ties, farming, business, and tourism. Indeed, a porous southern border was desirable for many people who lived and worked on both sides of the border. For example, by the 1920s, almost all of the farm workers hired in southern Texas were Mexican. Farmers needed these workers if they were to harvest their crops. This trend of increased dependence on migrants for agricultural labor, as well as many other jobs that U.S. citizens declined to fill, has continued throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, with the U.S. increasingly relying on cheap immigrant labor. Next slide, please. From the beginning, border enforcement has been rife with illegality and abuse. The official enforcement of the southern border began in 1924 with the creation of the Border Patrol. It acted as a kind of vice squad, enforcing prohibition as well as laws against gambling and prostitution. The Border Patrol attracted rough men with dubious records and nativist and white supremacist attitudes. Many were former Texas Rangers, some engaged in lynching and other racist and criminal actions. From the beginning, the Border Patrol, which is now Customs and Border Protection, CPB, has had expansive authority. Its actions were not subject to the same constitutional protections and procedural safeguards that govern U.S. criminal law. For example, the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution requires both a warrant and something known as probable cause to believe that a crime has been committed before an arrest or search can take place. Neither one was required for the Border Patrol. Instead, Border Patrol officers stopped cars on the mere suspicion that they might contain illegal border crossers. From its inception, the Border Patrol conducted mass raids and deportations. In 1946, Congress expanded the Border Patrol's authority, enabling it to act beyond the border, extending up to 100 miles into the interior. As Francis Cannell pointed out last week, almost 2/3 of Americans live within 100 miles of at least one U.S. border. Thus, the Border Patrol could stop and question people without probable cause or any suspicion at all, engaging in racial profiling of people who looked Hispanic, Asian, or Native American. Often, Border Patrol agents targeted workplaces, sweeping up and deporting American citizens as well as non-citizens. Operation Wetback in 1954 was one of the most notorious actions of the Border Patrol, resulting in the deportation of more than 1 million people in a single year. Abuses by Border Patrol officers were often ignored, if not encouraged. There was no individual or organizational accountability. If we examine the history of the Border Patrol from the 1920s through the 1950s, we see that it set a dangerous precedent for today's immigration system and its current abuses. Next slide, please. Chapter 5 takes us into an era of temporary optimism, I would say, about immigration. In 1965, immigration law was liberalized by the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965, the INA, and this is the basic law that still governs today, although it has been amended substantially over the last 5 decades. The Immigration and Naturalization Act was in response to the civil rights movement, a booming U.S. economy, and the need for a skilled labor force. Nonetheless, the law still reflected the enduring legacy of racism. Next slide, please. The Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965 was a response to and fueled by the dramatic expansion of the United States economy after World War II, as well as the lessened fear of immigrants, especially those fleeing from communism. In the 1950s and 60s, Americans' fear of communism, both in Europe and Asia, was deep and widespread. At the same time, America was becoming politically more liberal and ever so slightly more tolerant of people seen as different. The Immigration and Naturalization Act made immigration more open and eliminated the quota system of the 1924 National Origins Act, but its sponsors still thought that the law would preserve the U.S. as a primarily white nation. Indeed, Ted Kennedy, one of the proponents of the law, promised doubtful legislators that this would be the case. Next slide, please.
Just so you know, 15 minutes left before scheduled breakout time.
Okay, thank you. Under the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965, Southern and Eastern European people were now considered white and therefore permitted entry, but these groups no longer wanted to come to the U.S. at the same rates they had previously. The new law had 3 key aspects which fundamentally altered the U.S. immigration system. The law gave priority to 3 groups: highly skilled immigrants, immigrants who already had close family ties in the U.S., and the goal was to keep families together under the concept of family reunification. Some sponsors of the law believed that this would preserve the whiteness of the U.S. population, assuming that new refugees would look like that new immigrants would look like current Americans. Of course, family reunification may also be referred to as chain migration, the term that Donald Trump used with derision. Today, about 2/3 of American immigrants arrive via family sponsorship, although it can take decades to move up the waiting list. The third group of people given priority under the 1965 law is refugees. As Sumati will explain, the decision to give priority to each of these groups had profound and unanticipated consequences. Next slide, please.
In chapter 6, we talk about developments in the post-1965 period after the enactment of the more liberal immigration law. And so we're talking about the period between 1970 essentially through the 1990s. This period can be characterized, I actually have used the word toxic out of Cohen. It's a toxic brew concocted by nativists and white nationalists to villainize, criminalize immigrants, ending America's openness to outsiders. Essentially, what happened was a narrative develops in this period, or is deliberately developed, about immigrants, legal as well as the undocumented, that affects perceptions, shapes national conversation that is with us to this day. Why does this happen? Next slide, please. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 that Linda just spoke about changes the color of the American population. There are a lot more people of color entering the United States. The undocumented immigrant population increases from 500,000 in 1969 to 3 million in 1980. So while legal immigrants are coming in from Asia, from all parts of the world, Chinese, Southeast Asians because of the war, there are still undocumented immigrants entering the country, and the numbers grow. This is also an absolutely critical period to understand, I think, going forward, to understand America's immigration policies. America, by 1970, is beginning to lose its global light. Japan and Europe recover. There's stiff competition now to Americans, and American corporations to make profit now go to, they transfer jobs abroad. The middle class begins to suffer stagnation in incomes, inequality grows, and you have the stirring of economic anxiety, popular anxiety. This is also the period in which conservatism rises with Nixon, Reagan, Bush, and themes of law and order and welfare chiefs emerge. Next slide, please. In early 1980, two events take place that make an impression on American minds. The first was, and you probably recall this, the Mariel boat crisis. And it was believed that Castro was sending us his convicts and the mentally ill. There was also the drowning of Haitians who were attempting to come to this country on a raft. And it is not lost on immigrants, on Americans, that these are immigrants illegally coming to this country, and that they are people of color, very dark people. Next slide, please. I think before that.
Well,
okay, I'm sorry. Next slide, the Registry Act. Okay, I'm sorry, just leave it right here.
Right.
Congress is very concerned about the growing number of immigrants. So what it does is it tries to provide a solution. And it does so by granting amnesty for the first time in American history, in the history of immigration, in the Immigration and Reform Act of 1986, for the people entering between 1982 and 1986. In other words, anybody that came before 1982, that is, it would be from 1972 to 1982, is not included. And of course, it would not include that came would not cover people that came after 1986. And the reason is because, as we said earlier, the 1972 Registry Act had not been renewed. And so this was an attempt to kind of regularize people. Okay, the next slide, please. The backlash against this amnesty was horrific. It intensifies and subjects not just the undocumented, but also legal immigrants in general to all sorts of negative attitudes and policies. The backlash was led by a very organized group of people. And they were very concerned about the failure of the government to stand up to illegal immigration that they showed obviously in the amnesty provision. And so the resentment against government grows. And that's a theme that you also see, in Trump's rhetoric. You see it today in the rhetoric of the people who are, concerned about the border, that the government is not doing enough. So who were these people? Well, they are nativists and white nationalists who organize, and they go mainstream. They ally with respectable organizations and capitalize on popular anxiety to aggressively push anti-immigrant sentiment and legislation that demonizes immigrants. They create images of immigrants as criminals, as burdens on public resources, very picking up on the themes of Reagan, the welfare queen, if you recall, and as terrorists, as you will see, precipitated by some events in this period. Next slide, please. The backlash leads to court challenges by organized groups and laws that were enacted that attempt to limit immigrants' constitutional rights, deny them public resources, and criminalize them. And the very, very sad and to me very revealing thing that I wasn't really aware of was that it was done by both Republicans and Democrats. We'll stay on this slide while I provide you, I think this is the last slide, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yes.
Yes, okay.
Yes.
I'm just going to give you a little bit of a background on what these nativists and because I think it's an extremely important and interesting part of the history of this period. Nativism and racism, as you are now totally aware of, were very much in the air in the 1970s as the color of America's population changed. However, it had to be mobilized and made respectable, palatable to elites. Cohen describes the organizing work of one particular individual, a John Hancock, who was an ophthalmologist with an interest in population growth and its environmental consequences. Those of us who are very much interested in the environment are will learn something about him. In the 1970s, the focus of the connection between population and its environmental consequences was on sheer numbers, not on population groups' carbon imprints. Tantum brought together groups concerned with population and the environment, the anti-welfare opponents, groups concerned with drug control. As you recall, the Reagan period was very much about that issue, and also with national security. Stanton's allied included respectable organizations like the Sierra Club and Zero Population Growth, and prominent environmentalists. One name that may be recognizable is Garrett Hardin, who was in the University of California system. His coterie of supporters included a rich Mellon family member who belonged to the KKK and was an anti-communist, who gave Stanton approximately $17 million. He used this support he had and the money to start two organizations, the Federation for American Immigration Reform FAIR was concerned with pushing legislation, and CIS was the research arm to support that. CIS, the Center for Immigration Studies, twisted data to serve opposition to immigration. Both CIS and FAIR are labeled as hate groups by the SPLC, the Southern Poverty Law Center. FAIR and CIS capitalized on the Nixon and Reagan rhetoric on law and order and welfare, and to paint immigrants as a drain on public resources. They went to court to challenge the rights of immigrant children to get an education. The Supreme Court upheld that right and also established that children of immigrants born in the US have 14th Amendment due process rights. FAIR lobbied at the state level. They were responsible for the California's Proposition 187 in 1994 that challenged the giving of public benefits to immigrants and asking public employees to snitch on undocumented people that they knew about. This attempt was rejected by the federal district courts. FAIR and CIS add to their arsenal in 1993 the Association of Immigration with Terrorism. This is new. Up until now, it has been about public resources and criminal activity, but now it's about terrorism. This was followed by the 1993 bombing, the first bombing of the World Trade Center basement by Middle Easterners. CIS gins up fear of immigrants despite plentiful data that the chances of any American being a victim in a terrorist attack was very slim. In 1990, due to the efforts of these lobbying groups, the border wall begins. And in 1993, 1990, through the end of the 90s, Bill Clinton and the Republican Congress, led by Newt Gingrich, begin to really accelerate the criminalizing of immigrants. In 1994, before that starts, Operation Gatekeeper was established by Clinton. This is the direction to the US Border Patrol to close the regular entries into the border. And it also led to the death of many, many immigrants. Bill Clinton follows up in 1996 with a set of laws that essentially accentuate the criminalization of immigrants by defining minor crimes as aggravated felony. Things like a forgery, for example. And he institutes a policy through these legislation, he and Congress institute a policy whereby immigrants can now be incarcerated if they're accused of crimes, often without held in detention, often without any kind of judicial review, and subject to deportation. In the meantime, while all of this is going on, and he cuts out welfare through the Welfare Reform Act to the immigrant population. And while all of this is going on, America's immigrant population grows from about 3.5 in around 1970 to about 8.5 million by the end of 1990s, simply because there was no way for immigrants to regularize themselves, because, as you recall, the Registry Act had not been renewed after 1972. So what we have is we're entering the 2000s with lots of undocumented immigrants and no solution to them. And then we have the fact of 9/11, and that, of course, introduces a far more horrific period in the immigration story. Thank you.